Welcome everyone to the Royal BC Museum. On behalf of our CEO, Professor Jack Lohman, who sends his regrets for not being here today, I welcome all of you here for this really important discussion and presentation by Dr. Pamela Sugiman. I would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of Lekwungen peoples upon which the museum stands, and deepest respect and understanding to the peoples who came before us and who are still here. I'd like to introduce Dr. Jordan Stanger-Ross, who is Associate Professor of History at the University of Victoria and also the Project Director of Landscapes of Injustice, who will introduce our most special guest today. Jordan.
Thank you, and good afternoon. It's great to see on a rainy afternoon such a great crowd out to see the talk. It's a real pleasure to have Dr. Pamela Sugiman here with us for this event. She's an historian who I've admired for a long time, and it's been wonderful to collaborate with her these years on Landscapes of Injustice. Dr. Sugiman is Dean of Arts and Professor of Sociology at Ryerson University in Toronto. She's one of the country's leading oral historians and one of the country's leading historians of Japanese Canadian history. Her work is widely distributed and cited, and historians sometimes wonder, is our work being read? Is our work being appreciated? And certainly Dr. Sugiman's work is widely read and widely appreciated. It's widely assigned to undergraduate students, which I think of as the gold standard of academic achievement. So she has the opportunity to influence students from coast to coast with her writing. It's widely anthologized, so articles reprinted in collections, often collections for students as well. She's been recognized for her work by the Canadian Sociological Association with a Lifetime Achievement Award, and she's also been president of that association. It's been and she's here, sorry, I should mention, she's here as the Distinguished Woman Lecturer at the University of Victoria as part of a series for which submissions come from all across campus and all disciplines for distinguished women in the Academy to come and speak here in Victoria. And I think it's certainly Dr. Sugiman's scholarship and also the work that she's done in her career to foster the scholarship and leadership of other women in the Academy that probably caught the attention of the committee. She's also the Lansdowne Lecturer in History and has already given a couple of talks within the History Department to students and to all of the BC History Departments actually just this weekend. So she's really been contributing in multiple ways in her visit here. I want to mention also the book on which Pam and I collaborated, which is being launched here in Victoria at this event. The book's called Witness to Loss, Race, Culpability, and Memory in the Dispossession of Japanese Canadians, and we have a stand here in the back where we are offering this for sale. The book, I think, converges with the talk that you're going to see here in that it examines an unusual or a story not previously heard in this history that some of us may know in broad strokes already. That book is centered around the memoir of a Japanese Canadian, Kishizo Kimura, who participated on committees that forced the sale of Japanese Canadian-owned property. So Kimura first sat on a committee that forced the sale of fishing vessels, the industry in which he had made a living, and then second sat on a committee that forced the sale of the property in the neighborhood in which he had lived in Vancouver. And it was Dr. Sugiman who said, I think we can do something around this memoir after I had initially written an article on it. And so we've translated and published here for the first time large segments of his memoir in which Kimura in the 1960s and 1970s sought to convey that history in which he participated, but also to explain his actions. And then we've surrounded that with commentary of different kinds by historians, sociologists, a community member who lived through this history, different people trying to reflect on what the memoir and what that experience means to them. I hope it's an important book and an interesting book, and I'd invite you to have a look at it in the back. It converges, as I said, with what I think is a really important topic that Dr. Sugiman is talking about today, which is that other silence, as she conveyed to us in her description of this talk that many of you may have seen. Often Japanese-Canadian silences have been remarked in this history. But less often remarked has been this other silence of bystanders and witnesses who saw this history unfold in their community. Many British Columbians today are part of families who saw this history unfold. Dr. Sugiman is the first scholar to really take this history seriously. She's doing important and innovative work with, again, an unusual, underappreciated part of this history. So it's my great pleasure to invite her to come up and to speak to you about that work today.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Now, I'm considerably shorter than you, so I'm just going to make some adjustments. And thank you for that very kind introduction. And I know that you've had to make 4 introductions over the last several days. We've had a busy time in British Columbia. And thank you all for being here. I'm really honored. I'd like to begin by sharing with you a bit of a slideshow set to one of my favorite songs, which is Motherland by Natalie Merchant, written and sung by Natalie Merchant. And I offer this to you to provide some context for the discussion I'm going to participate in shortly after. So this, in this slideshow, a number of my family members and perhaps some of your family members, for those Japanese Canadians who are here in the audience, may appear.
Where in hell can you go?
Oh, this is a poem by Natalie Merchant.
Far from the things that you know, far from the sprawl of concrete that keeps crawling its way. About 1,000 miles a day. Take one last look behind. Commit this to memory and mind. Don't miss this wasteland, this terrible place when you leave. You keep your heart off your sleeve. Oh, motherland, cradle me, close my eyes, lullaby me to sleep. Keep me safe, lie with me, stay beside me, don't go. Don't you go. Oh, my fire and dying queen, tell me what have you seen? The lust and the avarice, the bottomless, the cavernous greed. Is that what you see? Oh, motherland, cradle me, close my eyes, lullaby me to sleep. Keep me safe, lie with me, stay beside me, don't go. Cause it's your happiness that I want most of all. And if there's anything that I can do at all, mercy me. If you want the best of it, if you want the most of all, and if there's anything shotgun ride. What makes me envy your life? Faceless, nameless, innocent, blameless, free. You tell me what that's like to be. Oh, motherland, cradle me. Close my eyes and lullaby me to sleep. Keep me safe, lie with me, stay beside me, don't go, don't go. Oh, motherland, cradle me. Close my eyes, lullaby me to sleep. Keep me safe, lie with me, stay beside me, don't go. Don't go. Don't go.
Many decades ago, when I began to research the history of Japanese Canadians with a focus on their memories of internment and dispossession during the Second World War, as well as their resettlement in the post-war years, a haunting silence permeated my thoughts. At the time of my early writing, the silences of the past were gradually being broken as Japanese Canadian community leaders, activists, and scholars, some of whom had directly experienced the internment as children and teenagers, began to publicly share their memories of the past. This unleashing of memory was both a strategic resource for, and at the same time, a response to the community's success in securing a redress agreement with the federal government of Canada. Japanese Canadian Nisei, second generation, and Sansei, third generation redress leaders saw the need to bring personal memories, if not into historical consciousness, then at least into the public discourse. Thus, while the redress settlement is most commonly defined by the government's official acknowledgement and financial settlement, equally valuable was its inspiration and legitimation of sometimes emotion-laden memories of internment. The memoirs, the community histories, and scholarly accounts that proliferated during the 1980s, 1990s, and into the present century significantly built on a small number of early books on the internment, now classic, notably Ken Adachi's The Enemy That Never Was, Barry Broadfoot's The Years of Sorrow, Years of Shame, and Anne Sunahara's The Politics of Racism. Inspired by these foundational works, my own writing on Japanese Canadians was part of the post-redress resurgence of memory. Like others, I was motivated by a strong desire to understand the ways in which structures and processes of racialization have intermingled with gender and class-based relations in shaping human experience. From the beginning, I was stymied by shared silences within the community, as well as by the implications of such silences for education, for history, for pedagogy. In constructing new narratives based on the personal memories of over 100, now moving up to 200 Nisei women and men, I now greet silence as something that is meaningful rather than a void, rooted in the past, but at the same time a signifier of the present. As Timothy Stanley, who has contributed to Jordan in my book, Witness to Loss, has said, the dispersal policy for Canadians of Japanese origin meant that there were no communities to support their speaking. The social and political framework in which they lived, in other words, inhibited, if not prohibited, the development of a community of memory. In this talk, I'd like to draw on oral history and personal memory in an exploration of the theme of silence, and the empty spaces that it has filled in the narratives of the internment. I reflect on the different articulations or expressions of silence in this history, its presentation in oral and non-oral forms, and its shifting meaning for individuals in lived experience. As well, I'll observe how personal memories, spoken memories, the disruption of silence does not always result in empowerment and reconciliation at a personal or societal level. Loss, mourning, and injustice coexist with memories of fun, adventure, and happiness. Acts of kindness and compassion are embedded in wider histories of racism. Sympathy and sorrow intermingle with complicity and self-interest, and emotion coheres with seeming indifference. In problematizing the concept of silence in oral history, we encounter complicated and messy relationships between personal memory and historical consciousness, friendship and family ties, political ruthlessness and bureaucratic detachment, individual testimony, and restorative justice. I begin my talk this afternoon by revisiting the intellectual, political, and emotional terrain that I have crossed as an oral historian, as a sociologist, as a mother, as a daughter, as an Asian Canadian woman from the working class. I now begin almost every presentation of my research with these personal reflections. And I don't do this to privilege individual attributes or to prioritize my own family history. Likewise, this is not an exercise in academic narcissism. Rather, I believe that my personal story is crucial to my scholarly project. I highlight the personal because as a Japanese Canadian Sansei woman, I relate to this project in significantly different ways than most of my research collaborators. As well, I underscore the personal because this is the site at which we can most clearly see the impact of inequality and injustice. We observe suffering and loss in individual lives. In defense of the personal, Sarah Ahmed, who is an academic feminist writer, in her book, The Culture of Emotion, Ahmad notes, the depersonalizing of justice can make injuries disappear and thereby protect those who harm others. States Ahmad, the personal is complicated and mediated by relations that make any person embody more than the personal, just as the personal embodies more than the individual. And with this in mind, Ahmad further challenges the assumption that remorse works to overcome injury in and of itself. My first encounters with silence were in my family of origin, and this is my mother's family. My mother is standing on the far right as a young girl. In the context of family relationships and memories, silence took the form of a cryptic past, unspoken yet not unforgotten. Shared and communicated silences defined my relationships with my surviving grandparents on the maternal side. These grandparents, known to me as Bachan and Jichan, grandma and grandpa, served as the first and undeniable reminders of my Japaneseness. Bachan and Jichan were also my strongest and most direct connection to the family's past and to the losses that characterize this past. The Second World War internment, the dispossession and relocation fundamentally changed my grandparents' lives. My Jichan, Zunichi Matsuoka, arrived in British Columbia from the Fukuoka prefecture of Japan in the late 19th century, and Haruno joined him years later as a picture bride. Together they spent years in the small town of Haney near BC's Fraser River, and here they raised 8 children and worked arduously, preparing land for berry planting. The Matsuoka family had just finished clearing roughly 10 of their 100 acres of land when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. And with this military strike far from their modest home, the Matsuokas began a long and painful journey filled with loss, the loss of their home, the loss of their farmland, loss of their eldest son who returned to Japan in disgrace and indignation, and ultimately loss of many traditions and culture. Relocated to Ontario, Zunichi and Haruno spent most of their post-war lives in the suburban home of their second eldest son and his wife and children. In the Scarborough bungalow where they lived, they spent their days watching American sitcoms, game shows, occasionally taking afternoon walks in the neighborhood and eating gohan, Japanese rice, and okazu, a side dish for supper. While there were frequent visits, picnics, and other family gatherings with Bachan and Jichan, our communication with one another was framed by silence. Although they had resided in Canada for many decades, my grandparents never spoke the English language. They claimed, at least, to have no proficiency in it. In turn, while both of my parents were conversant in what they called peasant Japanese, or bad Japanese, my Japanese vocabulary was limited to a handful of words. Rather than communicate through the medium of language, then, my grandparents and I expressed our appreciation, fondness, and love for one another through smiles, nods, and the quiet exchange of small gifts. These shared silences were among the many indirect consequences of the internment. While I experienced complete assimilation, absorbed into the dominant culture and shameful of my Japanese ancestry, my grandparents retained their Japanese identity, yet they were isolated and dependent in the suburbs of Toronto, bereft of their cultural networks and without a livelihood. Though my Jichan lived to be 101 years old, almost nothing is known about his memories of internment in the BC interior. Now, my mother, Ritsuko Matsuoka Sugiman, was born and raised in Haney, where she and her siblings attended Alexander Robinson School. And when not in public school, they grudgingly attended Japanese language school and otherwise helped their parents work on the berry farm. With most of her family, after putting in time in Hastings Park, Ritsuko was ordered to move to Rosebery, the smallest and most northerly site of internment in the BC interior. And here my mother spent roughly 4 years filled with emptiness, uncertainty, worry, and silence. The memory that resonates most powerfully, however, a memory to which my mother has remained faithful, is that of her train trip from BC to Ontario. While Ritsuko has, on the whole, been reticent about her life during the war, in response to the occasional question, she would typically narrate the story of her long, lonely train ride and arrival at Toronto's Union Station in the early hours of the morning. Like many young Nisei women, my mother was immediately put to work as a domestic for an affluent family in the neighborhood of Rosedale, the very rich neighborhood of Rosedale. And rife with emotion and very heavy with drama, she would often return to this journey, reflecting on it in her mind, and the loneliness, the fact that she was alone, dominated her narrative. Forgotten and very fearful. Apart from this, she remained silent about these years of her life. And this is my father, Ross Tatsuro Sugiman. The most profound silence is that of my father. Ross Tatsuro Sugiman was born and raised in the city of Vancouver, and along with his brother Don Toshihiko, sister Yoko, otherwise known as Joan, and their mother and father Iwazo and Chio, my father lived in a small house on the corner of Princess and Cordova in what was then Vancouver's bustling Japantown, now known as the impoverished East Side. A young man, at the outset of war, Ross decided not to leave his hometown in spite of government orders. And for this personal act of rebellion, he was picked up by the RCMP, detained in the city's immigration building without his family's knowledge, and subsequently put on a train headed for a prisoner of war camp in Petawawa in northern Ontario. The epitomizing memory that my father shared infrequently, though consistently, as I was growing up, was of confinement in Petawawa, behind barbed wire. But apart from a description of the stigmatizing uniform that he was forced to wear, a white shirt with a red circle on the back, and the guards who watched over him, he was noticeably reticent about his past. What my father did powerfully convey to me were the emotional remnants of his experiences of racism. Though he died when I was only 18 years of age, I have enduring memories of the feelings that my father shared long after the war. These emotions ranged from unease to grief to anger and outrage at the treatment of Japanese Canadians and his loss of personal dignity. These feelings withstood the test of time, and whether or not they were consciously transmitted, they shaped my present day orientation to the internment and to other acts of social injustice. My mother's and my father's lingering memories, alongside my memories of grandparents, aunts, and uncles, distant relatives who left for Japan, and old family friends, generated in me a growing and pressing list of questions about the internment, about social and economic injustice, and the long-term impact of these social forces. My community's memories, transmitted from one generation to the next, prompted me as an adult to think deeply, perhaps for the first time, about the racist hysteria of wartime BC state-sanctioned violations, the precariousness of citizenship rights, and the erosion of the Japanese language and cultural traditions within Canada. This is a photo of myself as a very young girl and my parents in Toronto with my blue-eyed blonde doll. It was fairly typical. Early on, I decided to draw on the oral history method to confront the silences in my family's and my community's past. And together with photographic and documentary evidence of 22,000 Canadians of Japanese origin, these memories formed not one spoken narrative, but many. In some ways, the narratives are consistent and uniform. In other ways, they seem irreconcilable and contradictory. Nisei narrators told of curfews, censored mail, restricted movement, and even prior to the war, mandatory registration with the government. To this day, some Nisei still keep their official registration cards tucked away in their wallets. Many talked about the stench of horse manure and urine in Hastings Park, the makeshift sex-segregated detainment quarters in the former Pacific National Exhibition fairgrounds. People offered narratives of loss of education, opportunity, employment, aspirations, and relationships. There was also loss of property in the form of houses, fishing boats, farmland, small businesses, trucks, and automobiles. Most Japanese Canadians, of course, did not own property in the pre-war years, yet this did not spare them from loss. The majority of people lost household goods, family heirlooms, pet dogs and cats, and personal possessions of many kinds. Most profoundly, they lost freedom, time, and dignity. As the war was coming to an end, in an effort to rid the West Coast of people of Japanese origin, the federal government ordered the dispersal, resettlement, and assimilation east of the Rocky Mountains. And faced with an artificial choice, either go east or repatriate to Japan, most left BC for low-wage work in Ontario, Quebec, Manitoba, and Alberta. Tragically, by the end of the war, roughly 4,000 women, men, and children had been deported to Japan. Knowledge of these historical facts and the human experiences behind them filled for me a void of silence. The reconciliation era, post-reconciliation era internment narrative that slowly began to seep into public discourse, however, is still incomplete. The Japanese-Canadian redress narrative, similar to other narratives that have been born out of the contemporary truth and reconciliation era, has focused on victims of racist government policies. Notwithstanding the unquestionable value of the lived experiences of voices of the oppressed, this narrative has eclipsed the agency, in this historical case, of non-Japanese Canadians who also experienced the internment as bystanders to racism. And while standard historical accounts have focused on politicians and bureaucrats, the architects and the engineers of the internment and dispossession in such analyses, the rest of the Canadian population remains without voice and agency, if not culpability. The omission of non-Japanese Canadians is problematic for a host of reasons. Commenting on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, on the residential school system in Canada, Glenn Coulthard argues that the TRC temporarily situates the harms of settler colonialism in the past and focuses the bulk of its reconciliatory efforts on repairing the injurious legacy left in the wake of this history. Indigenous subjects are the primary object of repair, not the colonial relationship. The objects of repair and subjects of study in reclamation projects, in other words, are those groups that have been oppressed within racialized and colonial systems. The silence of white Canadians in comparison is not problematized, and the onus for understanding racism and racialization is on the victims themselves. Among those who witnessed the events of the internment were politicians, civil servants, who implemented government policies, RCMP officers, who monitored men in the POW camps, as well as women, children, and the elderly and sometimes unwell in the ghost towns in the BC interior. There were also teachers, employers in the form of factory and mill owners and operators, farmers, middle class and wealthy homemakers, co-workers, social workers, and Christian missionaries. In addition, many families purchased at bargain prices the houses, businesses, fishing boats, farmland, and household and personal goods previously owned by Japanese Canadians. Among many bystanders, I'd like to highlight in the remainder of this talk the memories of 3 non-Japanese Canadians. They've shared their memories of the events of the Second World War: Calvin Gill, Eileen Carefoot, and Marilyn Overland. And to provide more context to Eileen Carefoot's interview, I'll also share the memories of a Japanese Canadian woman, Grace Mamoto. The first, Calvin Gill, from Maple Ridge. Originally, the Gill family lived in New Westminster, and they came to own a sawmill, which I believe they still own, in Mission, British Columbia. Calvin speaks in the clip that I'd like to play for you about what it was like after his friends and neighbors, Japanese Canadians, left.
Okay, well, we grew up in New Westminster, and in Wood Street was the address, 353 Wood Street. And there was a lot of Japanese there, and immigrants, and they were my friends that I played with. 2 or 3 families. And then one morning I woke up and they were taking my friends. The army trucks had come in. I don't know how long that was going on. I guess they probably knew they were going to come or something, but I didn't know. They came there that morning and they loaded everybody up, and if they had more than one bag, they threw them out on the street. And my mom and her friend, they must have known what was going on, because the Japanese lady gave my mother her sewing machine, a bunch of other more valuable stuff that she thought at that time. And around the same time, they must have had some warning, because I know they buried some stuff, and I know where it's buried, but it's in somebody's backyard.
I should mention that Calvin Gill is a South Asian man, if I didn't already mention that, and he does at various points in the interview talk about his status as, to use his words, a minority Canadian, has, he believes, influenced his memories, and he thinks often about this family that was taken away, and has some plans, I believe, to work with the current owners of the home and to try to dig up these buried treasures, possessions. Among the many things that were buried was a gun, for example, and Mr. Gill was explaining to me that many people at that time owned guns, and of course there were dishes and other household, various household utensils, toys, etc. Now Kelvin's memory is very similar to those shared by other maybe not typical, but it is similar to some of the memories that I've heard voiced by other Japanese, non-Japanese Canadians, and it really fills a void in history for me. After all, Japanese Canadians themselves don't know what it was like to live in the city in the days and the months and the years after they were forced to leave their homes and to leave their businesses. So our understanding of how non-Japanese Canadians perceived the uprooting and dispossession, it's limited also because they've seldom been asked to draw on their personal memories of these historic events. The burden of memory has been carried as a result by Japanese Canadians. With lesser responsibility to document the events of the internment, Kelvin's narrative is new, it's also very unrehearsed. His memory is deeply personal, and when listening to the recording as a whole, it becomes clear that while he speaks of the erasure of his childhood friends and neighbors, of equal meaning is the impact of these memories on him as an individual. Now, it's I'd like to introduce another clip from my interviews. Among the most poignant of my eyewitness narratives is that of Marilyn Overland, daughter of, as you can see here, the late Glenn McPherson. Born into a privileged family in Manitoba in 1910, Glenn McPherson graduated with a law degree, but he soon played a leading role in the liquidation of property owned by Japanese Canadians. And to the day of his death, McPherson maintained that the liquidation and sale of this property was not for the good of the, was for the good of the nation, continuing to argue that Japanese Canadians posed a security threat to the country and that they were loyal to the Emperor of Japan. His daughter Marilyn talked about what it was like to be the daughter of this well-known bureaucrat.
Sure, I went to West Van High School.
Oh, yeah.
But I started the elementary school, Caulfield, and then went to the high school. And there was still this core of Japanese kids that we'd been brought up with,
Yeah.
and they were our friends, you know.
Yeah.
And but I remember later on having friends who it became clear that you don't share that information because of the reaction was very. Certainly when I was at university, very hostile that my father was, I didn't talk to him.
And if you didn't catch that, the last statement she made was, "I didn't talk about it." And she makes that statement many times throughout her interview. As this interview suggests, the impact of racist actions crosses generations. One doesn't have to directly experience an historical event in order to have a memory of it. What we need to better understand is the way in which memory is passed on from generation to generation and how it's reinterpreted and revised over time. How can we understand what is shared, what is preserved, and what is lost and kept within the realm of silence? As oral historians, I feel I need also to listen to people not solely as individuals, but as members of families, as living collectively in households, in workplaces, in churches, and communities. We can't simply attribute memories to the individuals who articulate them at a particular moment in history. Personal memories, after all, are pieces in a large and intricate web of relationships. Marilyn's full narrative of the internment is informed by two striking memories. One is of her father, chief architect and engineer of the Dispossession. The other is of Japanese Canadians, the Japanese Canadians that she personally met long after the war, during years of human rights struggles, civil rights, later redress and reconciliation. Throughout our conversation, Marilyn struggles with the dominant narrative, of which her father played a key role in constructing and defending. Yet ultimately, she does not reconcile it with her personal experiences. personal experiences as a teenager and young adult. According to Marilyn, right up to the latter years of his life, Glenn McPherson, as I noted, upholds the view that the internment was necessary. Perhaps out of family loyalty, she gives voice to this view. But when it's directly challenged by an individual whom she meets or an idea, Marilyn chooses silence. Describing 2 different periods in her life, she stated, "And I remember not talking about it again, and as you heard, I didn't say anything." Now, the next clip that I'd like to share with you is of a Japanese-Canadian woman, Grace, and she was interviewed by one of my research assistants, Alex Peckett. Over the course of the interview, Grace begins to remember a number of personal losses and family losses. She first states that in 1941, they took away her birthday, which falls on December the 7th, and she'll always remember that birthday. Later in her narrative, she reflects on a Japanese doll, something that had been lost and then later found.
I can't remember.
The gramophone you said probably stayed.
I wonder if that gramophone did come to Beamsville. No, it couldn't have, because we went from Toronto, came to Toronto April the 1st, I think. My cousin Dennis was born that day. My aunt wasn't home. We asked my uncle where Auntie Mary was, and he said she's in the hospital. And it was April Fool's Day, and Uncle John was always a joker, so we thought he was kidding. But apparently Dennis was born. Yeah, that's Buddy's brother. So, no, we went to Toronto and stayed with my aunt. She had the boarding house. We stayed there for a couple of days, and then we went to Beamsville on the bus from Toronto to Beamsville. So I don't think the gramophone was there then. I just wonder where it got ditched. So that was about the only thing. I don't remember Mom having any. When we were living on Rushroom Road, and they were going to demolish all the houses for the apartment building, I was living in Don Mills then, and Mom bought some of her old stuff, put in my storage room downstairs. Yeah, like I had a split levels at a big area with crawl space. And I went through her boxes, and I came across some of those dolls that you use on Girls' Day and on Boys' Day. But, my mom never brought them out during the war, or even in Beamsville. And May would be the Boys' Day, March would be the Girls' Day. I had never seen them until I ruffled through all her boxes. So she must have tried to keep something. But then she never observed the holidays, so the dolls never came out. Yeah. So she didn't have much. She just had 2 or 3 dolls. That was it. But no, I don't. The only thing I know, in Vancouver, I had a Japanese doll, quite a big one. Not those things, but a real doll with a kimono on and everything. And I don't know what happened to that doll. It may have gotten left behind in Vancouver, because I certainly didn't have it in Lemon Creek. So I guess those are some of the things that got lost.
But you think the dolls that your mother put in your home in Don Mills probably came from Vancouver?
Well, that doll didn't come, but a few of the, what they call seko dolls, came. Not many. think it's a couple from the boys and couple from the girls' festival. That was it. But as I say, she never displayed them afterwards. So,
She observed the holiday
the March the 3rd and May the 5th.
up until leaving Vancouver.
Or I wonder if at one point, maybe they were trying not to be too Japanesey. Especially in Beamsville because it was a white community. That's probably why she never brought them out. Yeah. So.
Lastly, Eileen Carefoot. Eileen grew up in and to this day remains an active resident of the fishing village of Steveston, and she volunteers at the Gulf of Georgia Cannery. Through the eyes of a child and in the context of family relationships, Eileen remembers how her parents rented a house that had previously been the home of a Japanese-Canadian family. What was it like to move into a house that had been occupied by your Japanese-Canadian neighbors? How did it feel to find built into the walls of your home the private possessions of its former inhabitants? To discover personal belongings that were not hidden and forgotten, but purposely tucked away for safekeeping in the belief that they could someday be reclaimed.
So anyways, we, in this house that we rented, of course, we were pretty happy because upstairs the people had left, well, they left almost everything. The beds, they were homemade wooden beds with a mattress, so we didn't have anything, so we slept in the beds. And downstairs there was kindling. My mom was very sad. I remember she said, "Isn't this terrible?" The people had to even leave the kindling. They left their spices in the cupboards. And because, of course, they could only bring a few clothes. And my brothers, who were very curious, were upstairs. And they were banging on the walls. And, of course, they heard something, or they could tell it was hollow. They pulled the boards off, and they'd stored their belongings, pictures, and those lovely Japanese dolls in the cases. And being children, we played with them. My aunt came out and she said that was a shame, so she took one home. But we didn't have any idea what they were. And part of the custodians, they were given the job of looking after, supposedly, the belongings of the Japanese people. I don't know if they were allowed to sell them or what, but my mom needed a sewing machine, and there was one in the house down the street. And of course we didn't take anything, but later at night you could hear the trucks coming up down the road from Vancouver, and they were taking everything of value from the houses, and nothing was being done. So my brothers went over and they said, well, might as well take the sewing machine. It was a treadle sewing machine for Mom.
Now, though Eileen was only 6 years of age at the time, her narrative is strikingly vivid and it's very richly detailed at the time of the internment, that is. Significant was her family's discovery of the hidden belongings, but also, for me, significant is the way in which this now elderly woman narrates the dispossession of her home's former residents. I interpret Eileen's narrative as a composite. She moves back and forth from personal memory to historical consciousness. At one moment, she highlights her family's need and the practical benefits, if not enjoyment, of the previously owned furniture, the Japanese dolls, and sewing machine. Of course, we were pretty happy, she recollects, because upstairs the people had left, well, they had left almost everything. We didn't have anything, so we slept in the beds. I don't know if they were allowed to steal them or what, but my mom needed a sewing machine, and there was one in the house down the street. Eileen punctuates these statements with the expression of sympathy on the part of her mother and aunt. My mom was very sad. I remember she said, "Isn't this terrible? The people had to even leave the kindling." My aunt came out and she said that was a shame, so we took one home. But we didn't have any idea what they were. Eileen's narrative, like Calvin's, is unrehearsed, it's candid. Indeed, in some ways, Eileen presents parallel narratives, which, when read together, render the acts of bystanders to be normal, explicable, and justifiable. Within this context, even the act of looting is normalized. After all, everyone was doing it. Moreover, there were no state sanctions of such behavior. Nothing was being done, she explained. So my brothers and sisters went over and they said, well, might as well take the sewing machine. In presenting her memories, Eileen also mentioned that her family needed things. On the one hand, her mother repeatedly stated that it was a shame. On the other, Eileen explained that they needed. They were in need of a sewing machine. They were in need of spices. The previous occupants left almost everything, and this made Eileen's family happy because they didn't have anything. Many of the people who looted the homes of dislocated Japanese Canadians were themselves poor and faced economic adversity. Some were themselves visibly racialized. When we consider this, we see that Eileen's parallel narratives don't compete with one another. Rather, they are unified by the theme of hardship. They reflect the many tensions in and the hypocrisy that underlines histories of injustice. I'm just going to conclude with a little bit of an excerpt from one of my favorite novels by Julie Otsuka, When the Emperor Was Divine. We moved silently through the halls. We said yes and no problem. We said thank you, go ahead, after you, don't mention it, don't worry about it. Don't even think about it. In closing, I read these lines because for me they resonate, the emotional undercurrent of this talk. The concept of silence guides our understanding of the relationship between personal memory and history and the ways in which racism and racialization have shaped human experience and feeling. Silence emerges out of powerlessness and power. It secures authority, and in the face of authority offers a tool for the vulnerable and marginalized. It may also serve as a protective shield and at the same time be a powerful defense. Just as people convey marginality and fear through silence, so too it can be a function of privilege and power. Silence is a topic that to date has not been highly problematized or questioned. Yet personal and collective silence, whether it take the form of omission, the forgotten, the hidden, or the protected and preserved, is a meaningful metaphor in personal memory and public history. My family's direct and communicated memories have inspired me to reflect on the implications of silence for historical knowledge. I sought to broaden my repertoire of memories and continue to break silences in order to deepen my understanding of the patterns and nuances of racism. In seeking this understanding, I recognize that memories of racist events are not the exclusive domain of the targets of racial oppression and discrimination. Eyewitnesses and bystanders to racism include those who are racially privileged, as well as those groups who themselves are visibly racialized. In other words, the burden of remembering racist history must be shared. It is a weight that my community cannot and need not carry alone. While oral history has customarily given voice to those whose voices have not been spoken or heard, it also helps us to understand the role of silence in personal memory and in the public narrative. Silences permeate oral history and shape historical consciousness. It's a useful tool that carries social and political meaning. How it is used, whether deliberate or unconscious, agentic or passive, is not the issue. What's important is that silences, like words, tell us about relations of power and privilege, a racially unequal and unjust society. Oral history, then, is not simply a collection of words and voices. Rather, oral history offers us a framework, a theoretical framework for understanding the ways in which structured relationships shape personal experience and human expression. Thank you.
We now have just over half an hour for some question and answer. Yeah, in front.
I was just talking to my neighbors here before the talk. I graduated high school in '69, and up to that point, I'd never heard anything about this. It was not taught at school. If Do you know at any point do you remember or know at what point it started permeating the Canadian consciousness about what happened? Like when it was actually talked about?
I'm not sure what. Do I need to use the mic?
What I'm talking about was the broader issue of you being, Japanese Canadians losing all their stuff and being forced out. We never heard anything about it.
It did not permeate my consciousness until I was, after I graduated from university. I had heard a little bit here and there. Apart from my own family, I had heard a little bit in public. I think it was with the redress movement. I think it's really at that point that it became legitimate to talk about publicly. And we have in the project in which I'm involved, Jordan heads Landscapes of Injustice. We have a teacher resource group that is working to bring a more complete story to curriculum.
Thank you.
Yeah, I see a hand here.
I don't know anything about the redress movement, and I just wondered how it was brought about. And you mentioned, I think in your talk, that there was some kind of financial settlement. Could you just explain a little bit about how that happened and why did the government do it?
Yeah, I can say a little bit. There are people in the room who know a lot more because they were a part of it. The settlement was reached in 1988, and Japanese Canadians, those who who had survived, many had passed away by that time. Those who had survived and had lived through the internment were given a sum of $21,000, which was, that I think is a symbolic gesture. And there were various other components to the agreement, the establishment of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, commitment to study racism within Canada more broadly beyond the community. And I know, I don't want to put Henry on the spot, but Dr. Henry Shimizu sorry, is here, and he was very much a part of it. I don't know if you want to add anything, Henry.
Well, I can give you the 3 points of the agreement that was made in 1988. That was in September of 1988, with Brian Mulroney's government at the time. The head of the redress committee in the Japanese community was Art Miki and his group, the settlement group, and they hammered out an agreement in something like 2 days, well, a little over 2 days. It was 17 hours that they continuously went through a negotiation format with the government of Brian Mulroney, which is a conservative government in 1988, and that group was his actual person that was actually going to be the major negotiation member was Lucien Bouchard, and the Minister of Culture at the time was Ernie Weimer, and they had worked out the negotiations to be $21,000 for individual compensation for everybody that was born from the date of 1949, because that was the date when the restrictions were removed. So anybody who was born before that period of Japanese descent in Canada, born in Canada, would then receive $21,000. That was in relation to almost the exact amount that was negotiated in the United States a few months before. So we were following what was happening in the United States. The second one was the formation of a Japanese Canadian Redress Foundation. The foundation was given $12 million to what you might call regenerate. When the removal was carried out in 1942, of course, the other thing that they took away was not individual materials, but the associations of Japanese Canadians at that time, they had many, like in Prince Rupert, where I was born in 1928, there was a building that was put up by the Japanese community, which was called a kaigan. It was a four-story building. It was built by hand by all the carpenters, built shipbuilders that became what you might call, and there were many of them that were already in the construction companies at that time. So they built this building, and that building, of course, was just left as is on March 23rd, 1942, when we were removed. It was a removal which actually started in a matter of about 48, a little over 48 hours. Told that we had to move out of Prince Rupert. So there's very little time to do anything with buildings like that. And these were all up and down the West Coast. They had Japanese community buildings that were owned by the community, and these were lost. Not only that, all those lost were their books, records, photographs, and things at the same time of those community possessions. And so our job as the Redress Foundation was to try to recreate some of the communities that had been destroyed by the removal. There must have been at least 50 or 60 communities up and down the coast. In Prince Rupert, when we left Prince Rupert on March 22nd, 1942, there were over 600 people in the train, and they were all mostly women and children. I was at that time 13 years of age, so I remember that period of leaving. The other thing is, most of the men, able-bodied men, people under the age of 45 and over the age of 18, had been removed to work camps or to prisons one way or another. So there was very few men in the community at the time of our removal. By that time, my father had left it, and his partner, we owned a restaurant and a hotel, and both my father and my father's partner had been sent to a work camp. Later on, when we went into the internment camp, we first went to Hastings Park and then to the internment camps on the interior of BC. And many of the men then returned to help build these internment camps. So we built the internment camps ourselves. We've also found out that the sale of that materials, to some degree, there was a reason why they were starting to sell these things or do what they could do to see. It was both a matter of payback to some degree by the members of the BC Security Commission against what they felt that we were responsible for the war in Japan. We had no idea that was going on in Japan. We had no idea why the war was started. We knew there was a lot of trouble, but we were not involved in that. And the second part of compensation was they needed money. The government needed money, and so a lot of these, they hoped that they could get some money out of the removal by the confiscation of a lot of the properties. But you got to remember that it became a fire sale. I mean, if you knew that if you didn't buy, it was like an auction. If you just knew that if you waited for a few minutes, like a Dutch auction, it's going to go down. I mean, you're going to go down, and if you waited long enough, you can get something that you would have had to pay $300 or $400 for, and you can only pay $3 for. You knew that was going to happen.
See, this is why, Henry, you make me nervous in the front row, because you're the expert on all of it.
Well, anyhow, that's what happened. And anyhow, the other thing that did happen is you mentioned the business of why there was such a silence from the community before the redress was carried out. there was such a silence before the redress was carried out. I'm not here to talk to you. But there's a reason for that. You know that the older Japanese, the older Japanese, that what you call the Issei's, these are people that came to Canada from Japan, having been born in Japan and educated in Japan and come to Canada for work or for other reasons. But anyhow, that's the Issei. There is amongst them a stoicism and as well a tendency to be a little bit less. They didn't like the idea of being a nail that stuck out. You had to be a community. You had to be, and that was one of the things that they found about the Issei's, that even the white population found, that they were very law-abiding. They listened to authority. Whoever was the government, they felt that they knew best. And then the Issei's, when we were finished with the internment camps, we were all going back into the general community. And you can imagine, I was now getting into 45. I was 17 or 18. I was just getting ready to go beyond the regular high school. We were too busy trying to make a living, trying to get an education, trying to do something in Canada, and we were starting with nothing, so we had to really scramble and work hard at it. And I got into medicine through help from other people, and there was other white people who helped out. And it was there then that I took medicine. Well, I was out of action as far as the Japanese part of me was concerned for at least 20 years. And it took me until about the 1970s before I became a member of the community and began to carry out my active part in the development of the community. And eventually, I was the chairman of the redress committee nationally in Canada, and it was up to us to have the 12 million. And I know that interesting enough, we got 150 projects that we did to try and these were for books, films, plays, as well as senior citizens' homes, anything else that was a community project. We had 150 projects plus 150, and at the same time, we happened to have the right financial situation that occurred at that time. It was a bull market at that time. We put the $12 million right away into the bank, and before we started taking money out for grants, we had already made something like $6 million. So it was, we ended up with starting off with 12 million, ended up with 18 million. And at the end of 5 years, our job was supposed to be finished. And actually, I did finally go with a group of my board. We went to Ottawa and talked to the minister and Secretary of State and showed them our books. And they said, and we said, well, we're supposed to be finished at 5 years. That would be 1994. And they said, oh my God, you can have all the time you want. You keep on going, we might probably be paying. He said, we should put our money, government money in your foundation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Let's see another question here.
You mentioned that after camps closed that nobody was allowed back at the coast. How long did that period last?
Oh, sorry, I didn't.
That's 1949.
Yeah. It was, and of course, 1949, and of course, many people never returned. Like my father, for example, never had the money to return to.
Well, there's nothing left. Of all our property, they're all gone.
So I forgot my last slide. I started on the personal, and I'm ending on the personal. This is my mother, who's 93 now, and my daughter.
Another question here.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you for your added history as well. I'm really interested in what you were saying about the other visibly racialized communities at the time, and I'm wondering if you, in your interviews, talked to anybody from the Chinese community or the First Nations communities about how they saw what was going on and whether they reacted to it at all. Thank you.
I've only heard one interview with an Indigenous man. He didn't say very much, but he did talk about the fishing boats and how the only way in which he could get a fishing boat was to take the fishing boat that was offered, you know, at a very low cost, previously owned by a Japanese Canadian. We are hopefully beginning to work on a whole set of interviews with Chinese Canadians. That hasn't happened yet. I want to be really respectful of other communities and ensure that we put everything in context, and that we do so in a way that doesn't result in the misuse of the information that they share with us. I know that there was a very complicated relationship between Japanese Canadians and Chinese Canadians.
I can say one word on that. Sure. Just one word. The question was that you were wondering about what are the problems, why it took so long for the redress group with the government to come to a conclusion or come to the negotiation. First we had to get them to the negotiation table. Before that, the whole process of redress started in 1977. 1977, you know, it was considered our 100th anniversary. The reason being, as some people said, if you open the gates, there'll be a flood come through. And the way we went about developing the negotiations between the government and the Japanese Canadian Redress Foundation, or the redress group, that was by the NAJC, the National Association of Japanese Canadians, was done through a long process. It took us 10 years before it finally came to the table. And the reason, there was always sort of blocks made along the way. And you got the impression that they were afraid that we're going to open up the gates. And next thing you know, every group that had a grievance would eventually jump in, and they would learn how to do it, because it requires a certain development. Public relations, lawyers, especially lawyers, and everything else. I mean, it's not just okay, we're going to go and get our money for losing all our money, our properties. It just doesn't happen that quickly. It has to be done with it had to be a legal way so that we would not have to go backwards again. And if you read the book by Anne Sunahara called Politics of Racism, you'll see that she was a lawyer. She is a lawyer. She's still in Ottawa, and she was from Edmonton, where I was born, and where I was living, rather, not born. I was born in Prince Rupert, living in Alberta. She, in her writings, you'll find that she has a lot of the legal aspects of how they get about. It was very difficult for them at the beginning of 1941 to decide how to work with Japanese Canadians, because they were aware, the government was aware that we were born in Canada, and legally we were Canadians. So you were putting a Canadian into an internment camp, making him pay for his jailing, and then saying, oh, I'm sorry, it was all a national disaster. It was not a national, because in 1944, Mackenzie King admitted to the House of Commons that the reason for the removal of Japanese Canadians from the West Coast was not because of national security, because that's what they said it was. It was because they wanted to get rid of us from that BC.
Thank you. Another question?
Thank you very much for your talk. You had said that your father was sent to a prisoner of war camp and that there was a lot of silence about that. Did he communicate anything, either through words or through his silences, about his experience there?
Very little. He was extremely angry about it. He, I think, had a conflicted relationship with things Japanese and people Japanese. He was very much drawn to Japanese culture, and at the same time, he didn't ever identify as a Japanese or a person of Japanese origin. And he did communicate that anger. There were times throughout, and I talk about this in the book, throughout my childhood, where someone would make a racist comment to us. You know, go back to where you came from, and he reacted very strongly to those comments, and that's the way in which I began to learn that his feelings about this were very deep. But he never gave me a lecture on racism or talked about his experiences. And that's one of my regrets, that I never got to ask him, because I was completely disinterested as a child. And I think that's a typical experience.
And could you just say a little something about these prisoner of war camps? Like what was the percentage of Japanese Canadians at these camps and the other prisoners?
I'm not sure what the exact percentage was. I mean, there were both Nisei and Issei, so Canadian-born and those men who were born in Japan in these POW camps, and I don't know what the proportions were, whether it was a fair number of Issei, but also many Nisei men. And my father was released from it before there was, the original one was in Petawawa, Ontario, and then they moved them all to Angler, Ontario, Northern Ontario. And my father was released before they went to Angler, and many of these men were put on to work on road camps in Northern Ontario. There were a number of personal testimonies some personal testimonies that have been published, experiences in the POW camps written by Japanese Canadians. And the relationship with RCMP, for example, was more complicated than one would think. They watched over them, but they also got to know them and had conversations and established some friendships. But those were years of extreme hardship.
Thank you.
I'll tell you a funny story.
Sure, give Henry a funny story.
The doctor in New Denver was a fellow by the name of Dr. Uchida. And he had been educated in Japan, and then he was a doctor, a general practitioner in Vancouver. He was the doctor in New Denver internment camp. And since he could speak Japanese, the RCMP realized that they need a Japanese doctor to go around to look at the other camps. So one of the Mounties, and the Mountie headquarters was in New Denver, would take Dr. Uchida down to Lemon Creek, to Popoff, Slocan City, and Bay Farm, up to Sandon, and over to Roseberry. And in each time, he would drive and take him. And he could not go by himself, of course. He had a car, but the car had been confiscated. So he would have to go with a Mountie. And one time when they were going down to Slocan City from New Denver, which was 20 miles away. It's a very windy, high road. In several areas, it's a real scary part of the road where you're right over the water. And anyhow, while they were going down one time, the Monkey was sitting right next to him. He knows him pretty well. And he said, "Hey, did you ever have a car?" And he said, "Of course I had a car." Eugenia says, "Of course I had a car. I was a general practitioner in Vancouver." He said, "Well, do you know how to drive?" "Oh yeah." He said, "Would you like to try and drive for a while?" "Oh yeah, I'd love to." So he jumped in the seat and the Mountie on the other side, and he started driving down the road, and he just kept going faster and faster and faster. And all of a sudden he turned around to the Mountie and said, "Do you think there are any cops around?"
I would just like to offer some information that might help people who want to do a little more reading about this. If you consult the website of the Japanese Canadian National Museum, you correct me if I'm giving you wrong information, there is a bibliography about the wartime experience of the Japanese Canadians. And there is one good book that I would like to recommend about the POW camp experience. It's called, I believe, Behind the Barbed Wire Fence, written by Takano, could be wrong, and he's a poet, and it was very helpful to read that. And at the back of that book is an article by an historian who does give you some good facts there and puts this man's memoir into context. So it's very helpful.
Thank you. Yes. I found that book extremely informative.
We have someone from the Nikkei National Museum who wanted to just let us know that they're here, and yeah, sure.
I was just about to sneak out the back door and catch my ferry back to Vancouver. But yes, thank you for mentioning the Japanese Canadian National Museum. Our current name is the Nikkei National Museum. We're located in Burnaby. And just back here, I've left some invitations to our current exhibition that will open on February the 10th. If any of you are in Vancouver, it's actually about the sugar beet projects, which was also an experience during the internment. But we are very honored to be partnered with the Royal BC Museum on the Landscapes of Injustice project. So much more coming up. Please stay informed. Make sure you fill out this contact list for Landscapes of Injustice, and we'll be sure to keep everyone informed. Thanks.
Thanks, Sherry. Another question?
Thank you for the presentation. I just have one question that the Japanese were allowed to move after 1949, and I was always so surprised by that. That was the experience of my mother-in-law and my father-in-law, who worked in the beet farms in Alberta and then were able to move to the interior. But did the government give some justification? Because if I'm thinking about it, at the end of the war, you know, how could you justify that there was some sort of kind of security risk at that time? Or
I'm wanting to jump in.
No, they forgot. They were in Ottawa, they forgot.
I don't know if there was ever any kind of official justification. I'm not aware of any justification.
Well, the justification that Mackenzie King came up with in 1944 to the House of Commons was it was not a national security reason why they went ahead and did it. They actually wanted to get the Japanese out of the West Coast because of their economic effect on the fishing. Salmon, they were the best salmon fishermen. The market gardening and in the forestry area were big areas that they were much involved with. And as far as I know, they thought that if they dispersed the Japanese Canadians when they left the BC and went, they wanted them in various places. They didn't want them in concentration. You know, the problem was that Mackenzie King himself had gone to the 1907 riots race riots between Orientals and white people in Vancouver. And he saw Chinatown there, and Japantown, which was on Powell Street, and I guess he must have thought this is where the breeding ground of resentment was coming up, because you had these ghettos. And so he gave the impression the reason is to get rid of ghettos. But they were the only two areas, and certainly in Japantown was the only place where Japanese people were congregated except for Steveston. And Steveston was another sore point because they dominated that town. They were the best salmon fishermen, and salmon was the biggest industry down in Steveston. So there was a very good reason why he had in the back of his mind that he wanted them. He said, oh, if we get them dispersed, they'll assimilate better. He didn't realize that in 1941, the girl that won the English contestant in English literature was not a white lady or a white school kid. It was Muriel, what was her last name? Fujiwara, who got the highest marks in English.
And if you're interested in Muriel Kitagawa, there's a book called Letters to Wes, which is really worth reading.
Who was her brother, and he became a doctor in Ontario.
We have time, I think, for one last question. Sure.
I really love your work. Thanks so much for all you do and your mother's generosity. I assign you 1,000,000 hearts from here for my Canadian history survey class. And I wonder about your daughter and how her stories have been changing since you wrote that. Just because she's up there.
Yeah, and when I told her I was going to add this to my slideshow, she was mortified. For those who don't know, and many of I'm sure don't, my daughter, when she was much younger, wrote a story because she traveled with me to British Columbia on some of my research trips. And she became very influenced, and she's very close to her bachchan as well, and knew about her bachchan's experiences. So she wrote a little story, she initiated this on her own, called 1,000,000 Hearts from Here. And it's about a young girl and her experiences in the internment, during the internment. My daughter, as you can see, is partly Japanese Canadian and partly white, and she identifies almost exclusively as an Asian person. It's very much a part of her sense of herself as a Japanese Canadian, as a young Asian woman. And she, knowing that I was making this trip, said, "Mom, I really miss those trips to BC. Why don't we take another trip, do a road trip in BC?" So we may do that in August. But she's very much aware of this, and has a very strong, and not that this happens all the time. Right now in her life, she has a very strong awareness of issues of racial injustice. She doesn't always admit it, but I know it's there.
Before we go, I just want to thank also the Royal BC Museum, which is more than just a host of this particular lecture, but also a partner on the Landscapes of Injustice project, in which this oral history cluster that Pam directs has been collecting these interviews. And on your way out of here, after you pick up as many copies as you need of Pam and my book, please go to the lobby of the museum where the coat check is, and there's a photo exhibit or light box exhibit on the Landscapes of Injustice project and the Royal BC Museum's role as a partner in that project. It's a small and attractive light box exhibit that they did a great job with and easy to see on your way out. So it's wonderful to work with the museum on this work, and we'll later show an exhibit here. I want to thank Dr. Sugiman again, and please join me in thanking her for a wonderful presentation. thanks to all of you again. Bye-bye.